2:18 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. The windows were open, but the room felt closed. The afternoon light spilled across the polished floor, pale and warm, the kind that makes dust visible if you look long enough. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, pushing humid air from one corner of the living room to the other. I sat near the window, hands folded in my lap, the envelope resting there with a quiet weight I'd grown used to carrying. Richard leaned back in his chair, one ankle crossed over the other. Confidence settled comfortably into his posture. He glanced around the room as if waiting for agreement before speaking. "You can't afford this house," he said, laughing lightly, like it was a kindness, like it was a fact meant to save everyone time. The sound didn't echo. It didn't need to. The room went still on its own. Someone cleared their throat. Another person shifted in their seat. I felt eyes turned toward me, careful, curious, already deciding how I might react. I didn't. I kept my gaze on the envelope in my lap, cream-colored paper, thick, unopened. Not yet, I told myself. The fan above clicked softly as it turned, marking time better than any clock. Richard continued, mistaking my silence for surrender. "We need to be realistic," he added, waving a hand as if smoothing the air. "This place comes with expenses, maintenance, taxes. It's a lot to manage." A lot to manage. I'd heard those words before, dressed up as concern. I adjusted my grip slightly, feeling the firm edge inside the envelope press back against my palm. The house around us, its wide windows, its steady bones felt like it was listening. I said nothing. There are moments when speaking too soon only helps the wrong people. And this wasn't the moment yet. 2:31 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. The house breathed like it always had. After Richard spoke, conversation tried to recover. Someone mentioned the weather. Another commented on the view, how the water looked especially blue that afternoon. The ceiling fan continued its patient circle, stirring warm air that smelled faintly of salt and old wood. I listened without joining in, my posture unchanged, the envelope still resting in my lap. I had lived in Florida long enough to understand appearances, bright rooms, open windows, smiles that arrive easily and leave just as fast. This house had seen all of that come and go. Storm seasons, quiet winters, long summers when the heat pressed everything flat and honest. I'd learned to match that rhythm calm on the surface, grounded underneath. Richard's words hadn't startled me. They had clarified something I'd already felt forming. He believes this is about money, I thought, about monthly costs and visible income, about what someone like me was meant to handle at my age. I glanced around the room slowly, noticing details others overlooked, the way the floorboards didn't creak anymore because they'd been reinforced years ago, the new roofline hidden behind fresh paint, the impact windows installed long before anyone thought they were necessary. Care looks invisible when it's done properly. My hands rested lightly on the envelope. It was cool against my skin, firm and precise. Inside were answers, but answers don't rush. They wait for the right questions. Richard leaned forward again, lowering his voice as if that made his concern gentler. "We just want what's best for everyone," he said. I nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. So do I thought. Outside, a gull cried and then went quiet. The house settled around us, steady and unbothered, and so did I. 6:14 a.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. Memory wakes before the tide. Long before estate meetings and polite laughter, my mornings began quietly. Coffee brewed before sunrise, paper spread neatly across the table. I married young and learned early that comfort only lasts when someone is paying attention. My husband understood work. I understood planning. Between us, we built something steady enough to survive both storms and silence. We bought property when no one wanted coastal land that needed patience. Back then, it was considered inconvenient, too humid, too slow, too uncertain. That suited us. We repaired instead of replacing, reinforced instead of showing off. While others borrowed against futures they hadn't earned yet, we paid attention to clauses, zoning changes, and the long view no one else had time for. When he passed, people expected me to sell, to downsize, to let professionals handle things. I thanked them and kept my records. Grief sharpens some people. It did that to me. I learned which advisors spoke in detail and which relied on charm. I kept those who respected silence and dismissed those who rushed reassurance. Over the years, my life grew simpler by choice. Same routines, same house, same careful habits. Neighbors assumed stability meant stagnation. Family mistook quiet for absence. I allowed it. There is safety in being underestimated, especially for a woman who no longer needs to explain her decisions. The house changed, slowly reinforced beams, updated deeds, layered protections invisible unless you knew where to look. Everything documented, everything deliberate. So when Richard laughed that afternoon, it didn't hurt. It revealed. Because I didn't arrive in that room unprepared. I arrived carrying decades, and decades, when respected, do not argue. They wait. 9:03 a.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. Confidence wears linen and smiles easily. Richard Holloway entered my life the way certain men always do, uninvited, but confident they belonged. He spoke softly, laughed often, and moved through rooms as if approval followed him naturally. Introduced as a family advisor, he treated the title like a credential he'd earned instead of one he'd assumed. At first, he asked questions that sounded respectful. Compliments came quickly. "You've done well keeping things together," he said once, glancing at my files without reading them. I noticed how his eyes skimmed instead of studied. Speed, I've learned, often replaces care when someone believes charm will carry them. The red flags were subtle. Richard summarized instead of explaining. Standard arrangements, he'd say, tapping documents he hadn't opened. When I asked for specifics, his tone softened, as if I were being spared something complicated. "No need to trouble yourself," he added more than once. "Trouble is what people call attention when they don't want it paid." He liked speaking for others, finishing sentences, filling silences I left open on purpose. When meetings ran long, he checked his watch. When I paused to think, he hurried conclusions along. Control, when dressed as efficiency, often hopes no one notices the seams. Once, when I declined a suggestion about restructuring the property, his smile faltered, just slightly. "You should trust the professionals," he said, voice firmer now. I nodded, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. Trust is never requested that way. By the time the estate meeting was scheduled, Richard believed familiarity had earned him authority. He believed laughter could define worth. He believed quiet people would step aside. He was wrong on all three counts. And I was still listening. 11:26 a.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. The first betrayal arrives disguised as help. The meeting was meant to be brief. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching dust in the air and settling on the polished table between us. Richard sat closest to the head, papers arranged neatly in front of him, as if placement alone implied authority. "I've already taken the liberty," he said casually, sliding a folder across the table, "of outlining the most sensible options." Sensible is a word people use when they want agreement without discussion. I opened the folder slowly. The pages were clean, typed, confident, too confident, suggested valuations, proposed timelines, recommendations that assumed my consent before I'd offered it. He spoke while I read, narrating outcomes instead of reasons. "This simplifies everything," he added. "You won't need to worry about the details." I have always worried about the details, I thought. That's how I survived them. When I asked how he'd arrived at the numbers, Richard smiled. "Market standards," he said, tapping the page. "Trust me." The phrase landed heavier than he intended. Trust, when demanded, is usually covering something thin. I noticed then what was missing. No signatures, no independent assessments, no mention of the documents resting quietly in my own envelope. My history had been summarized into convenience. "So you spoke on my behalf?" I asked. "Of course," he replied, surprised. "It saves time." Time apparently was more valuable than consent. Around us, the room stayed polite. No one challenged him. That was the point. Authority often enters by speaking first and fastest. I closed the folder and set it aside. "Thank you," I said calmly. Richard relaxed, mistaking courtesy for compliance. He didn't see the shift. He didn't hear the quiet note of finality in my tone. The first betrayal isn't loud. It's confident. And it always assumes you won't look twice. 1:03 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. The second betrayal arrives as exclusion. The next shift came quietly, the way tides do when you're not watching closely. Emails that once included me arrived already concluded. Conversations happened before I entered the room, then paused just long enough to acknowledge me before moving on without rewind. Richard called it efficiency. "There's no need to involve you in every step," he said one afternoon, standing near the window, as if the view supported his point. "It's a lot to manage." He spoke gently, almost kindly, as though concern could excuse omission. I listened. Silence has taught me more than interruption ever did. When documents arrived, they were summaries, not originals, conclusions without context, decisions framed as updates. My name appeared where approval should have been requested. Each time authority moved a fraction further from me, wrapped in reassurance. "I'll handle the calls," Richard said once, already dialing. "You don't need to be burdened." Burdened is another word that closes doors politely. I asked for copies of the estate correspondence. He hesitated, just a breath too long, then smiled. "They're lengthy," he said, "technical. You wouldn't enjoy them." He enjoyed deciding what I needed. Enjoyment has never been my measure, I thought. Accuracy has. The envelope stayed on my lap during those meetings, its weight steady, familiar. No one asked about it. They assumed, as Richard had, that what wasn't announced wasn't relevant. By the time I realized how many conversations had happened without me, The pattern was clear. This wasn't help anymore, it was replacement. Authority doesn't vanish all at once. It's edited out line by line until someone else is speaking for you as if they always had. Richard believed the room belonged to him now. I allowed him to believe it. Because the second betrayal isn't about what's taken. It's about what you're no longer asked. 4:18 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. The third betrayal crosses the line. The breaking point didn't announce itself with anger. It arrived wrapped in finality. Richard stood at the head of the dining table, papers spread neatly before him, his tone already decided. "We'll proceed without delay," he said, tapping a page as if that settled it. "The house will be listed. It's the practical choice." I looked at the paper. My name was there typed cleanly beneath a recommendation I had never agreed to. "You've already decided," I said. He didn't deny it. "Someone had to," he replied lightly. "This place is more than you can manage now." He gestured around the room, the high ceilings, the wide windows facing the water. "You can't afford this house, Helen, not long term." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Not concern, dismissal. The room stayed quiet. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. I felt the envelope in my lap, its edges firm beneath my fingers. So this is where he believes I end, I thought. "I wasn't consulted," I said calmly. Richard sighed, the sound of patience wearing thin. "We're past that," he answered. "The paperwork is nearly complete." Nearly. A word meant to hurry consent. Something settled in me then, not anger, not hurt, clarity. He hadn't misunderstood me. He had calculated me. He believed time and tone would move me aside. I nodded once. "All right," I said. Relief crossed his face. He gathered the papers, already transitioning to next steps. He didn't notice how still I'd become. The envelope remained unopened. The third betrayal wasn't the sale itself. It was the certainty with which he believed my silence meant surrender. And that certainty would cost him everything. 6:02 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. After the room empties. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs scraped back softly. Glasses clinked as they were cleared. Someone commented on traffic, another on the weather turning. Richard shook hands, confident, already moving past me, as if the decision had closed a door behind him. I stayed seated. When the house finally emptied, the quiet returned in layers. The tide moved in and out beyond the windows, patient and unbothered. I rested the envelope on the table and traced its edge with one finger. The paper was thick, official, unopened. I didn't feel shaken. I felt precise. I walked through the room slowly, touching nothing, noticing everything, the salt in the air, the faint creak in the floor near the hallway, the way the light settled on the walls just before dusk. This house had held years without asking permission. It wasn't fragile. Neither was I. Back at the table, I set my bag beside the envelope and opened it enough to confirm what I already knew. Tabs, dates, copies arranged the way I always kept them. Prepared doesn't mean dramatic, I reminded myself. It means ready. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. My hands were steady. My breath was even. Richard believed he had crossed a finish line. In truth, he had only revealed where he thought the limits were. That was useful. I slid the envelope back into my lap and closed it again, untouched. Tomorrow would require accuracy, not argument. Records, not reactions. As the sky darkened outside, a single thought settled in, calm and unmovable. Silence isn't retreat. It's the moment before you step forward with everything in order. 7:18 a.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. Preparation has a tide. Morning arrived softly, light slipping through the palms and settling across the dining table where my bag waited. I dressed the way I always did. Linen blouse, sensible shoes, nothing that announced a change. The truth already exists, I thought. It doesn't need new clothes. I set the envelope beside my bag and opened it fully for the first time. The papers lay exactly as I'd kept them for years. Trust schedules, deeds, notarized amendments dated and indexed. I checked each tab, not to reassure myself, but to respect the work that had been done long before anyone laughed in that room. The drive to town was quiet. Salt air, open sky. I parked near the law office just as the doors unlocked. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The man across the desk listened without interrupting. Silence did the sorting. I placed the envelope between us and slid the first document forward, then the next. He paused at one page longer than the others, eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in recognition. "These interests," he said carefully, "are layered, intentionally." I nodded once. We spoke in specifics: authority, standing, what needed notice, and what did not. He explained the sequence plainly, like a map drawn from experience. Accuracy doesn't rush, I reminded myself. When we finished, he closed the folder and returned it to me. "They'll assume the estate is already settled," he said, "until it's read." "It will be," I replied, "in order." Outside, the morning had warmed. I placed the envelope back into my bag, its weight familiar and steady. Preparation isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It aligns the pieces and waits for the moment they're needed. That moment was closer than Richard realized. 2:41 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida, when assumptions gather. The house filled slowly that afternoon, the way it always did when people expected something to be decided without them. Chairs scraped gently against tile. The ceiling fan turned with an unhurried rhythm, pushing warm air across the room. Conversations stayed polite, careful voices lowered as if volume alone might tip the balance. Richard arrived last, confident as ever. He glanced around the room, nodded once, and settled into his chair with the ease of someone who believed the outcome had already been agreed upon. Papers were stacked neatly on the coffee table, untouched. The envelope remained in my lap. They think the work is finished, I thought. They think silence means consent. Richard cleared his throat. "We should keep this simple," he said, smiling toward the others. "No need to complicate things." His eyes flicked briefly to me, then away, as if my presence were ceremonial. I felt the weight of the envelope through the fabric of my dress, solid, patient. The lawyer hadn't arrived yet. That was intentional. Timing matters when truth is involved. A relative shifted in their seat. Someone poured water into a glass, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Richard leaned forward slightly, confident enough to begin outlining plans that hadn't been approved, expenses that hadn't been authorized. He spoke as if ownership were already a formality. I said nothing. Minutes passed. The air grew thicker, expectation tightening like a held breath. Richard checked his watch once, then again. "He should be here by now," he said lightly. though the edge had begun to show. The doorbell rang. Every head turned. I lifted the envelope from my lap and set it carefully on the table, unopened. This is where listening ends, I thought, and records begin to speak. 2:49 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. When the record is read. The door opened without ceremony. My lawyer stepped inside, briefcase in hand, expression calm and precise. He greeted the room with a nod, then looked to me, not for permission, but confirmation. I returned the nod once. He placed his case on the table and removed a slim folder, edges aligned. "Thank you for waiting," he said evenly. "We'll proceed." Richard straightened, smile ready. "Good," he replied. "Let's finalize this." My lawyer didn't look at him. He opened the folder and began to read, not opinions, not interpretations, but facts, dates, filings, signatures. The house fell quiet enough to hear the fan tick. "Per the estate documents," he continued, "title to this property vested fully and exclusively with Ms. Helen Rose Fairmont." He paused, turned a page. "There are no liens, no shared claims, and no outstanding contingencies." A chair shifted. A glass stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Richard laughed softly. "That can't be right," he said. "She couldn't have—" My lawyer raised a hand not to silence him, but to continue. "Additionally," he said, "the trust structure assigns all associated assets, maintenance reserves, and discretionary authority to Ms. Fairmont, effective immediately, filed, recorded." I felt the room recalibrate, postures adjusting, eyes refocusing. The envelope on the table remained unopened. It no longer mattered. Richard's smile thinned. "I wasn't informed," he said. "You weren't required to be," my lawyer replied. I spoke then, my voice steady. "Affordability was never the question," I said. "Assumption was." The words settled. No argument followed. Paper doesn't invite debate, it concludes it. My lawyer closed the folder. "We'll proceed accordingly," he said. And just like that, ownership, quietly prepared, stood where it had always belonged. 3:06 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. When the room chooses. The silence didn't break it, reorganized. Chairs shifted closer to the table. Someone cleared their throat and didn't speak. The ceiling fan kept its slow rhythm, blades clicking faintly as if counting time that no longer belonged to anyone else. Richard stood first. "This is being taken out of context," he said, voice brighter than the moment called for. He gestured toward the windows, the ocean flashing beyond them. "We were discussing practicality." My lawyer answered before I could. "Context is established by record," he said calmly, "and the record is clear." Richard turned to me then, the smile replaced by something thinner. "Helen," he said, lowering his voice, "we can talk privately." Private is where assumptions live, I thought. "We are talking," I replied, meeting his eyes. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Here is fine." A relative at the far end of the room folded her hands. Another leaned back, reassessing. The envelope on the table remained untouched, an artifact from a different version of events. Richard tried again. "You should have told us," he said. "This affects everyone." "It does," I said. "That's why it was handled correctly." My lawyer slid a single page forward, its corner aligning with the grain of the table. "Operational authority remains with Ms. Fairmont," he said. "Any further action requires her consent." The word consent settled heavily. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. His gaze drifted first to the paper, then to the faces around him, finally to the floor. The room had decided where to look. I stood, smoothing my sleeve. "Thank you all for coming," I said, gentle and complete. "We'll continue." No one argued. No one interrupted. Conversations resumed softly, recalibrated around the truth now placed between us. As I walked toward the hall, the house felt unchanged, sunlight steady, ocean constant. Only the assumptions had moved, and they had nowhere left to stand. 4:18 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida, when confidence loses its audience. Richard didn't leave right away. He lingered near the veranda doors, phone in hand, posture fixed as if waiting for the room to return to him. It didn't. Conversations reformed in smaller circles. Names shifted. Eyes that once followed him now paused, then moved elsewhere. A cousin approached my lawyer quietly, voice low. A neighbor asked me about maintenance schedules directly, without checking first. The house settled into a new order without instruction. Authority doesn't announce itself, it's recognized. Richard tried to laugh with two guests near the window. The sound landed and went nowhere. One nodded politely and stepped away. Another checked his watch. The ocean breeze carried the faint scent of salt and hibiscus through the open doors, cool against my wrists. The ceiling fan clicked on, indifferent. I watched as a property manager, someone who had always deferred to Richard, crossed the room and addressed me. "Ms. Fairmont," he said, careful and clear, "would you like us to proceed with the coastal repairs next week?" "Yes," I replied. "Please coordinate through my office." Richard's shoulders tightened. He turned, then stopped himself, as if remembering a role he no longer held. The word temporary surfaced again, this time attached to him. Temporary influence, temporary access, temporary certainty. By the time the sun dipped lower, a small sign appeared on the side table. Estate administration, by appointment only. Not dramatic, just accurate. Richard left without saying goodbye. No one followed him. No explanation was requested. I felt no triumph in it, only balance. What had been assumed was now examined. What had been laughed at was now documented. Some downfalls are quiet. They happen when the room learns who to listen to. 6:41 p.m., Gulf Coast, Florida, when the body finally rests. After the house emptied, I stayed behind. The late light softened everything. The white curtains, the pale wood floors, the long table where voices had crowded hours earlier. Outside, waves met the shore with an unhurried rhythm, the kind that doesn't rush conclusions. I sat near the window and rested the unopened envelope on my lap, just for a moment longer. It was lighter now, not because its contents had changed, but because it no longer needed to prove anything. I set it aside and folded my hands, noticing how my shoulders finally lowered. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding myself upright. The quiet felt earned. Not relief exactly, release. I thought about the way dismissal settles into the body, how being underestimated can make you smaller if you let it. I hadn't let it. I had waited. Waiting isn't weakness. It's restraint with memory. It's knowing when the truth will carry farther than defense ever could. The house breathed around me, air moving through open doors, the soft tick of cooling glass, a distant gull calling once and then gone. I stood and walked the hallway slowly, touching the door frame where I used to mark heights, tracing the banister worn smooth by years of hands. Ownership, I realized, isn't only legal, it's emotional. It's the permission to stay without explaining. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. The salt air cooled my throat. Somewhere a light clicked off automatically. The house knew its routines. That night I slept without replaying words or rehearsing answers. I didn't need to be ready anymore. I already was. 7:08 a.m., Gulf Coast, Florida. Morning doesn't ask permission. Morning arrived quietly, light spreading across the porch like it had nowhere else to be. I made coffee and stood barefoot on the cool tile, listening to the house wake in its own way, wood settling, air moving, the distant hush of the sea keeping time. Nothing in my life looked different. The same cup, the same chair by the window, the same view that had outlasted arguments and applause alike. What had changed was smaller than appearances and stronger than words. The need to explain had gone. I thought about how easily people mistake calm for absence, patience for lack, silence for surrender. I had learned slowly, deliberately, that restraint is not a pause in strength. It is strength choosing its moment. Some truths don't arrive by raising a voice. They arrive by being read aloud on paper that knows its dates. I carried the envelope to the desk and placed it in the drawer where important things rest, not to hide it, but to let it be finished. It had done its work. So had I. Outside, a breeze lifted the palms and set them back again. The world continued, unconcerned with yesterday's judgments. I liked that about it. Life doesn't need permission to move forward, and neither do we. Before leaving the house, I paused at the door and allowed one last thought to settle, simple and certain. Never let anyone decide your worth by what they can see. Never trade your quiet for their comfort. Some of us don't announce our power because it doesn't need to be heard to be real. When preparation finally speaks, it doesn't argue, it stands, and the world adjusts.